Okay, so I'm gonna see if I could address race along with gender and um, heterosexism in the context of online games here, and I'm gonna focus on a few different ones. So I've already mentioned, let's see, so far Skyrim and Halo 2. Here though, I'm also gonna talk about World of Warcraft and League of Legends. So I'm choosing those because I've had a lot of online experience with those games, and I could relate those back to these a little easier. So, and I'll start off with my experience of heterosexism, or at least of sexuality in games, in World of Warcraft, which I played more than any of the other games except maybe Halo. And in that context, I didn't always identify myself as gay or as queer or anything like that in the game, even though I would at least now do so in my everyday life. At the time I played, actually, initially when I started playing, I would not have identified myself in my everyday life as like gay or queer or anything. That was right at the end of high school for me. A few years later, though, I did in real life, and it did in the game as well. But only when one of two things would happen. The first being if someone would start saying things, or calling, I should say, like another player or something like a faggot, which I saw more than once, in reference to like someone who wasn't playing the game as well as they were, or at least that's their perception. The second context would be for guilds in the game, where the focal point of the group was to be a guild of online players who identified as like gay or lesbian or queer in some manner. Usually it was just gay, lesbian, queer, not really trans or bisexual people self-identified, at least in those groups. So that's what I saw from that perspective in terms of like sex or sexuality in the games. And in terms of how that affected my way of navigating the games, I did feel uncomfortable when I did have to do groups, or I had to run instances with groups where people were being heterosexist, or especially like specifically calling people out or calling people names. Even if it wasn't me, because usually it wasn't, it was some other player, but it still made me want to leave the group, and I would sometimes. I might say something, but I didn't always vocalize it in those contexts. I did feel comfortable always vocalizing that kind of stuff, always calling out any heterosexism I would see when I was in the guild and on the guild chat. If that guild was in fact one that was focused on being more inclusive, I guess you could say. So I guess then I can move towards gender then. And for gender, I can probably stay with World of Warcraft, actually. And for gender, I would say it was pretty rare to encounter another player who self-identified as female, though there were many female characters, but they would identify themselves as male regardless, for example. Or there would be male characters who identify as female people behind the screen. For my own part, I always played a male character in World of Warcraft for all of my like serious characters, the ones that I developed for any length of time. And I would say more so than for most games, I did kind of focus on getting the character to somewhat resemble what I look like. That was the closest I ever came to trying to make my character aesthetically at least resemble me, even if the actions of those characters, of course, were like in a way related to me. And in terms of how I saw gender play out, in terms of social interactions, I think I felt more comfortable taking on the role of tank in the game because I identify as male, and I say that because and identify at the time mostly as cisgender too, meaning like I'm male-bodied and I also identify as like masculine, a man. Um, because I identify in that way and did so at the time, being a tank seemed a little bit more natural for me to do in the sense that being a tank in WoW means that you're kind of supposed to be like the man of the group. You're supposed to take the attacks, you're supposed to issue orders, you're supposed to be the leader and in charge of the situation in a given instance or raid. That position I never once saw occupied by someone who identified as female-bodied outside of the game. It was always a male figure, always a male voice too. Because when you play more seriously in the game, you don't just deal with text interaction with the people playing it. You'll use third-party software to vocally interact with your team. And so I would say that was probably the most gendered position in the game, and the time when gender came up most clearly. In terms of how people addressed women in the game, or like how that would differ from how male-identified people were addressed in the game, I didn't see that so much. Now that said, if a female-identified person were to take on the role of tank, I expect that there would be some interesting interactions between them and a typical group. Maybe questioning like how good they are at that role, for example. But I haven't ever seen it, and I don't expect to see it very often, so I can't say for sure. And let me see then. In terms of, and I guess to, not only did I feel, going back to like my own role as tank in the game, not only did I feel comfortable doing that, and I did it not initially in the game, but a little bit later on when I played, I did feel comfortable too doing things like vocalizing how I felt about what we were doing in a given instance or dungeon, things like that, issuing orders, things like that. And again, I think that was because of the way I identified and the way people identified me, vocally and through text and through my character. And let's see, so that would leave then how I experienced like race in the game. And this one I would say is actually the most difficult for me to see because unlike gender and sexuality, to like vocally, like to verbalize race is a little, I guess like trickier for people to do, at least in an explicit way. And I mean in the sense of, for example, for people to call each other like faggots or like queers or like gay in like a derogatory way online is pretty well accepted and still is, unfortunately. So that's one thing. And then again, for male identified